Today's video is brought to you by Ground News. Go to ground.news/ViceRhino to learn more. Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today, I decided to tackle an easier video with the hopes that I can actually get out a normal length video instead of the hour-long monstrosities that seem to have become my regular fare recently. So I'm looking at a short video on a channel called Christian Parenting, which tries to answer the question, how do I explain homosexuality to my kids? To which the correct answer is, of course, the same way you would explain heterosexuality. It's not rocket science. But of course, religious organizations always have a difficult time with this, because they've decided that being anti-LGBTQ is a hill that they're willing to die on. So I am here to hasten that demise. Metaphorically, Content Review Bot, that was a metaphor. But since we're on the topic of LGBTQ relationships, it's worth mentioning that the Biden administration recently finalized a change to Title IX regulations that add protections for sexual orientation and gender identity. But if you tend to get your news from sources with right-leaning biases, you might not have heard about this yet. And I know this because I regularly use the sponsor of today's video, Ground News, to compare the way different outlets treat the same story. With Ground News, you can easily see the bias of various news outlets covering a story, as determined by multiple independent news monitoring organizations. In this case, we can see that, of the 42 sources that have covered this story, 7 have a left-leaning bias, 3 lean right, and 30 are in the middle. But they also track the factuality rating of most news sources, which is again independently determined by multiple news monitoring organizations, and in this case, we can see that 88% of the outlets covering the story have a reputation for high factuality. When comparing headlines, you can sort the stories by things like the factuality reputation of the outlet, making it easier to avoid falling for fake news or partisan spin. Ground News also tracks the ownership of the outlets, simplifying the process of figuring out which news sources might be influenced by larger media conglomerates, without having to dig through the corporate financial records and parent companies to figure it all out for yourself. They do that for you. With their bias comparison tool, you can compare the differences between how the story is being reported on by outlets with different biases. In this case, we see that the left-leaning outlets are emphasizing the fact that, while this is progress, the lack of protections for transgender athletes seems to be a political strategy on Biden's part. The right, on the other hand, is emphasizing the idea that this is redefining sex in a way that will impact women's sports, while the center is presenting this in a simplified way without hypothesizing about political motivations or strategies. Ground News also features a For You page where you can follow specific topics of interest to you, like atheism or LGBTQ+. Subscribe through my link for 40% off unlimited access to the Vantage plan, which is the one that I use. Again, go to ground.news/ViceRhino for 40% off their Vantage plan. Ground News was the first company to ever sponsor my channel, and I've been personally using the service ever since. Subscribing today not only gets you access to a great product at an amazing price, but it also directly helps my channel. So thank you.
All right, this is a very common question in one of our day. So dear Matsons, how do you explain homosexuality to your kids? Our children see it everywhere, and I'm not sure how to explain it.
I'm not a gambling man, but I would be willing to bet you $1,000 that your kids see heterosexuality way more frequently than they see homosexuality. How do you explain that to them? Why is homosexuality a difficult thing to explain, but not heterosexuality? Now, sure, there are functional differences if you want to talk about the actual sex and reproductive aspects of relationships, but in the vast majority of conversations with your kids, that will be completely unnecessary.
As a Christian family, we want to love everyone, but we also want our family to stand on the truth that God's design for sexual relationship is the best design.
So you want your kids to grow up knowing that boys can have as many wives as they can afford to keep, and that these wives can be obtained in several different ways, such as raping an unbetrothed virgin, invading a city and killing all the men, taking the women as plunder, buying someone's daughter as a sex slave, hoping your brother dies without having kids first, so now his widow has to marry you, with the bonus of that one being that if you don't want to impregnate her, God might strike you down, and if nobody wants to impregnate her, then her pretending to be a prostitute in order to trick her father-in-law into impregnating her is fair game, with the Bible describing that action as righteous. Anyway, those are some of the marriage systems that God explicitly approves of in the Bible. We don't even get a hint that it's supposed to be one man and one woman until the New Testament, and even then, it's explicitly rules for certain church leaders, not the general parishioners, even if it could be assumed that they are rules because it is in fact preferable for a marriage to be one man and one woman, so church leaders are to lead by example. I mean, I'm sure apologists will point to Genesis 2:24 as being a hint at monogamous heterosexual marriage. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. But that verse is a slippery one, which has been interpreted to be about anything from divorce to incest to bestiality over the years, but linguistic analysis of that verse with specific focus on the verbs suggests that it's most likely about the powerful sexual attraction that causes people to look for relationships, even when such relationships are in opposition to the wishes or expectations of parents and society. The interpretation that it's about how God thinks marriage should be assumes that the verse is speaking prescriptively rather than descriptively, when that is not at all clear from both the context of the verse or the language it uses. The Hebrew word translated as leave is most frequently used in a negative sense, as in forsaking or abandoning. The common interpretation of this verse when looking at it as a prescriptive sense of this is how marriage should be, is that the man is leaving his parents' household and moving out to start his own household with his wife. But a house or home or household or anything like that is not mentioned by the verse. The man is abandoning his parents for a woman. As to the word translated as cling, it is usually fairly straightforward, but there are only 4 instances other than this verse where the Bible uses it in connection with marriage, and in every single one of them, it has a negative connotation and is associated with intermarriage between Hebrews and the neighboring tribes. It's also worth noting that in this verse, the man is leaving his parents to be with his wife. The norm when discussing marriage in Genesis is that the man continues to live in his parents' household, and his wife moves in with them. So this verse is actually at odds with how marriage seems to have worked in the rest of Genesis. Which brings us to the fact that this verse is agreed by most scholars to have been a later insertion. It's a striking departure from the narrative, where the narrator actually breaks into the story to leave an explanatory note. The rest of the story completely lacks such interruptions, and if this verse is removed, the flow of the story is much more natural. The man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." That flows way better than, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and they were not ashamed." Yeah, I read that in a way to emphasize how out of place it is, but that doesn't change the fact that it is out of place. And while scholars are divided on exactly when it was inserted, the evidence seems to point to a post-exilic time, based on the fact that there are 0 references or allusions to that verse in any Jewish writings during the Babylonian exile or earlier. And given that the other writings from that time period were extremely concerned with the issue of intercultural marriage, urging men who had already married non-Hebrew women to give them up in order to not forsake God, and telling unmarried men that they should only look for Hebrew wives, this dating makes sense. And with that context in mind, I will quote from the conclusion of Dr. Megan Warner's paper that I've been getting all this information from. Far from setting out to regulate and restrict the institution of marriage, Genesis 2:24 acknowledges, without narrational censure of any kind, the propensity of men to pursue inappropriate marriages that defy wishes and schemes of their parents and, by implication, society and religious institutions. So it seems that this verse is an etiological insertion. It's an attempt to explain why a known phenomena was happening, the phenomena of intercultural marriage. Dr. Warner concludes that it's not a condemnation of such marriages, simply an observation and an explanation for why it happens. And why have I gone to such great lengths to talk about this verse that is only tangentially related to the subject of the video? Both to point out that reading it as a prescription of how marriage should be does not make sense, and to bring to light just how ludicrous it is when apologists talk about what they interpret as being the plain reading of the Bible. I have barely scratched the surface of the intricacies and nuances of this one single verse, and I've only referenced one paper in order to do that. There are literally thousands of papers dealing with the interpretation of this verse. Is the one I chose the best one? Maybe, maybe not. But given how many different conclusions can be drawn about this one single verse, can we really say with certainty that it means exactly what the evangelicals who notoriously ignore any biblical scholarship that doesn't agree with their pre-drawn conclusions say it means? I would argue no.
Okay, the reality is that anything we share about this question is going to trigger or offend or be confusing to someone who's listening.
Yeah, that's true. Anytime I make a video that focuses specifically on anything LGBTQ related, there are always a handful of comments from people saying things like, "Wow, you're normally good when it comes to debunking religious nonsense, but in this one, you just swapped one religion for another." So, given that I'm going to get hate from someone no matter what stance I have, it seems to me the best course of action is to make sure that my stance is in line with actual data. So, for instance, the fact that legalizing same-sex marriage has a positive impact on the mental health outcomes of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, whether they are married or not, indicates that, if we care about them, we should legalize same-sex marriage. The fact that negative health outcomes are significantly associated with family rejection of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people indicates that we should educate people and encourage them to be accepting. Now, these studies focus specifically on lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, but given that these negative outcomes are the result of minority stress, the stress that minority groups feel when they are discriminated against, and that the minority stress model has been shown to apply nearly identically to trans and gender diverse people as to lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, there is no reason to expect that those results would not also be applicable to trans and gender diverse people. Not that there's a lack of research showing that gender-affirming care has the best outcomes for trans people. That's actually the largest section of my list of trans-related research that you can find by going to research.vicerhino.com. And as a nice little bonus that's not really related to this, in the same issue of the journal Pediatrics that the paper on family rejection was from, there was another paper that compared the sexual behavior of adolescents who pledged to remain virgins and those who had not. And they not only found that there was no difference in whether or not they had had sex after 5 years, but that the ones who pledged to remain virgins were less likely to use protection. This isn't really directly related here, but it does highlight that pressuring kids to stay virgins until marriage not only doesn't actually work, but puts them at a greater risk of pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections. So once again, God's plan seems to not be the best one for us.
So we're asking that you hear what we share with a message of grace. So we're speaking specifically to this parent who believes deeply in God's design and is really wanting to teach their children how to love everyone and yet explain homosexuality.
And there's the beauty of being an atheist. I am free to love everyone and explain homosexuality without having to worry about there being a contradiction between those two positions. Now, I will be totally honest here, I don't actually love everyone. And realistically, Christians don't either, despite what they'll tell you. Actions speak louder than words, after all. But not only is it functionally impossible to love everyone, I'm not sure it's even a healthy mental state to attempt to reach. I couldn't find any research specifically on trying to act as though you love everyone at all times, but it does seem closely related to the concept of toxic positivity, where people try to suppress their negative emotions in order to stay positive in all situations. Toxic positivity is bad for the people on both the giving and receiving end of it, and acting as though you have a deep, positive emotional connection with everyone you meet seems quite closely related to the concept of toxic positivity, so yeah, I don't love everyone. I do have a basic level of respect for everyone just by virtue of them being human beings, but you can respect someone's humanity regardless of your personal feelings for them. Trying to force feelings of love when they aren't there will result in dishonesty and frustration.
So really, and we are from Oregon. It's something we've been dealing with since our girls were tiny.
Great! So homosexual relationships should be normalized for your kids, and shouldn't require any further explanation than that they're just a thing that exists, same as heterosexual relationships.
I remember those videos that our girls would watch, the normal shows that we would turn on. Yeah. They would get their TV time, and I would see the same-sex parents on the shows. It's a common part of what kids are watching every day.
Is it though? I mean, seeing heterosexual representation is way more common in everything. Like, in Bluey, the adult main characters are heterosexual. In Miraculous, like half of every episode is dedicated to the female main character obsessing over the male main character. In the Sonic the Hedgehog movies, they hint at a homosexual attraction between Dr. Robotnik and one of his henchmen, but the couple that take Sonic in are heterosexual. In The Little Mermaid, Ariel and Eric are heterosexual. And I could go on. Pick any random movie or TV show, and you've got a much better chance of it prominently featuring a heterosexual couple than a homosexual one. Hell, even in The Owl House, a show aimed at young teenagers, which was lambasted by the group 1 Million Moms for having very prominent LGBTQ representation — 1 Million Moms has about 4,000 followers, by the way — the first hints of the main character's sexuality is shown when she thinks a boy is cute. So yeah, she does wind up being bisexual, but if you only saw up to that episode, you would have thought she was heterosexual. If you think there's too much LGBTQ representation in modern media, then your view of the world is massively skewed. We live in a world where just having a gay couple exist on screen with no dialogue for a few seconds is enough to get outraged calls for that show's cancellation, as happened with the reboot of DuckTales. If you don't feel the need to explain all of the heterosexuality that is in children's media that completely dwarfs the homosexual representation, then why would you feel the need to explain the homosexual representation?
Our daughters were 3, 4. So at that age, we're having to already start talking about the difference between mom and dad and God's design in Genesis versus what we see even on TV and around them.
I have seen zero representation of anything other than heterosexual relationships in shows and movies aimed at kids in that age bracket. Most shows for that demographic don't have any romantic relationship on display, but those that do usually have a mom and a dad, and that's it. I'd like to know what shows you're watching that have such a massive LGBTQ representation aimed at kids in that age. Like, seriously, I would like to know so I can share it with my partner's kids who are in the 4 to 6 age bracket. And yes, dear commenter who is typing about this as I speak, in between writing the script and recording the video here, I have in fact seen that Bluey is finally going to have a queer couple shown on their show. Like, how many episodes are they in now? Like a couple hundred? And they finally get one queer couple that is not even the main character, so that's representation.
And then in kindergarten, our oldest, Adonaiah, came home. One of her very first questions from public school was, Mommy, Daddy, there are friends at school who are talking about having 2 moms.
Here's the thing. If kids are exposed to the existence of diversity for their whole lives, then it's not a culture shock when they experience it in a new context like school. So if your kids were actually inundated with this sort of thing from their media consumption, then that wouldn't have been a noteworthy part of their day. I suspect that these guys might not be entirely honest about their experience. I could be wrong, I don't know their kids, but if they were already used to such things, then why would they need to ask questions about something that had already been normalized for them?
So it is a normal place to have to talk to our kids, and what we're going to say is just, you talk about it all the time.
That's right.
I agree, and I do. I make sure that my kids know that I will be there for them no matter how their love life ends up looking. So that way, they aren't going to feel the need to hide things from me when they start becoming interested in relationships. Hell, in my deepest dad fantasies, they'll even come to me for advice from time to time.
Everywhere, anywhere, explain that that's what homosexuality is 2 people of the same gender in relationship with one another. And as they get older, we talk about being in sexual relationship with one another.
Okay, I don't normally comment on people's facial expressions because that's something that's just really easy to misread or read too much into. But am I wrong in saying that she looks absolutely terrified by what she's saying?
And then being able to compare that all the time between what God's design is from Genesis 2, between Adam and Eve.
There it is, Genesis 2. I'm not going to reiterate that whole thing here, but suffice it to say that unless this is the only instance in the entire Bible where those specific words are used in a context of marriage relationship, are being used in a way that has nothing to do with intercultural marriage, then it's a pretty safe bet that whoever originally wrote verse 24 intended it to be about that specific aspect of marriage. Which, if we then force a prescriptive interpretation on the verse, would mean that God's design for marriage is for intercultural marriage to be the norm. There have definitely been worse ideas taken out of the Bible, but I don't think that's where we're going here.
All right, I'm going on and on. What would you like to say?
Yeah, this topic needs to be handled with care, but with intention. And talking to your kids about this and normalizing what's being normalized for them with your kids is not affirming something here, but it's simply saying, yeah, that's what you're seeing.
Why would you not be affirming, though? There is a not insignificant chance that one or more of your kids may not be straight and cis. By going out of your way to avoid using affirming language to talk about LGBTQ people, you are setting the stage to have them try and hide that from you, to the detriment of both their mental health and your relationship with them. My relationship with my kids is way too important to jeopardize by being all judgy about sexual orientation and gender identity.
We're seeing it too, and we're seeing more and more and more of this, and you will see more and more and more of this.
And that's a good thing, as personal contact with groups that you are prejudiced against have a tendency to reduce your prejudicial feelings. And honestly, if I were to venture a guess, that's why the fundamentalist churches that are more vehemently anti-LGBTQ are seeing a drastic decrease in their membership. It's easy to sit in the pews and hear about how horrible gay marriage is, with the accompanying fear-mongering about the slippery slope about how allowing gay marriage will ultimately lead to bestiality when you don't actually know anyone who is LGBTQ. But with the increasing visibility of LGBTQ people in recent decades, when you sit in the pew and hear that same sermon, but you have a friend who grew up with gay parents whose house you've been to, people that you know and care for, then it's harder to hear about the evils of gay marriage when they're right there, just being a normal household but with 2 dads or 2 moms. So as we see more and more LGBTQ representation in our culture and media, we will become more accepting as a culture, and hopefully get to a point where sexuality isn't even a thing that matters. You love who you love, regardless of what's between their legs. Sure, in such a world the majority of people will likely still be straight, but to just treat relationships other than the ones where everyone involved is heterosexual and cis as just normal relationships would be amazing, because people want to have relationships with the people that make them happy, and there's no reason to oppose that. Well, no good reason. You can oppose it because an ancient culture who thought that stars could fall out of the sky opposed it, if you like, but don't pretend that that's a good reason for your opposition.
And here's the difference. And first, it's important to affirm again that all people, what you do want to affirm is that all humans are worthy of dignity and respect.
End your sentence there. I beg you, for your own good.
Yes.
And so you affirm that.
That is a biblical worldview.
And that's loving, and that's a biblical worldview, as you just described. But at the same time, then you want to contrast it with what God talks about in relationship. And Genesis 2 paints a clear picture about this, his design and his purpose.
Nowhere in Genesis 2 does it say that the scenario that is being described is the only possible romantic relationship that God would approve of. To pretend otherwise is disingenuous at best.
And I think that we use the term brokenness because we're all broken.
Doing that whole "we're all broken, therefore when we say being gay is wrong, we're not singling them out or attacking them" is a really gross tactic. You pretend that by saying that you recognize that you're a sinner too, then telling someone that God thinks their relationship with their romantic partner is an abomination somehow is not you being shitty. But just imagine if a gay couple came up to you at some point in your life and told you that your marriage was disgusting and offensive, an abomination. Straight couples definitely shouldn't be allowed to have kids. Have you seen how the kids of straight couples do worse in school? Oh, but don't worry, we're all bad people. I told a lie once. It was so horrible. I just need forgiveness from Jesus, just like you do, for having a romance. That would be hurtful, would it not? I get that you sincerely believe that you are communicating God's desires or whatever, but your doing so will have zero positive impact and a definite negative one. So it would be better for everyone if you just kept it to yourself. I don't see Christian organizations making videos called "How to Talk to Your Kids About Divorce" with similar stories of kids coming home confused about their classmate who had only one parent or whose parents don't live together. Yet divorce has more Bible verses forbidding it than homosexuality, and people who have had at least one divorce are way more common in the population than LGBTQ people, and I actually checked to see if they had a video dealing with kids in divorce, and indeed, they do. And it's actually full of some really good advice, like trying to maintain consistency for the kids as much as possible, providing therapy or counseling for them, stuff like that. It's actually a pretty decent video. The only change I would make is to explicitly state to look for a licensed therapist, don't just go to your pastor who says he's a counselor but has no real training. But not once did they mention that God's plan for marriage is for divorce to never happen, so you need to do what you can to get back together with your ex. And to be clear, it's a good thing that they didn't do that, but the Bible's teaching on divorce is more clear than it is on homosexuality. Don't do it unless there was cheating. Yet somehow, they're able to see past their idea of God's plan for a marriage when it comes to divorce, despite it being much more vocally opposed than same-sex relationships in the Bible. But because Adam and Eve were a man and a woman, God's plan for marriage clearly didn't include same-sex relationships, so that's just off limits for everyone for all time. And they probably actually recognize how horrible it would be to tell a divorced person that they need to get back with their ex for no reason other than an old book said so. But because that's a relationship dynamic that they're not bigoted against, they can actually empathize with that. But to an outsider looking in, the double standard is blatant and gross.
Right? And we include ourselves and everyone in that space in our understanding of God's design. We're broken without him.
If every single person that God ever makes is broken, then what does that say about God's skill as a creator?
And here's an example of brokenness. And here's examples of brokenness in us. And we need God's help to repair.
Yeah, but when you say you need God's help to repair you, you're talking about stuff like, sometimes I lie and I'd like to not do that anymore. But when talking about LGBTQ people, what you're saying is, who you are is an abomination. You can never have the kind of relationship that will make you happy. The fact that you don't see a difference here is very concerning.
And the good news about that is that God takes a long view on that. And it's harder for us. We want to see that change quickly.
Yeah.
But we've been encouraged and challenged to remember that he has a long view in mind as it relates to what that looks like.
And remember, by repair here, he means subjecting people to the torture that is conversion therapy. And torture is not me being hyperbolic. The consensus among experts is that conversion therapy is a form of torture, which results in, quote, significant or severe physical and mental pain and suffering with long-term harmful effects. If being gay meant that you were broken and God actually fixed people, then you would expect conversion therapy to be safe and effective. The fact that not only is it not safe and effective, but swings all the way over into dangerous, degrading, and inhumane torture, demonstrates that either God is cruel by creating people in a way that he disapproves of and then making the fix for it impossible, or else God doesn't actually condemn homosexuality like you think he does. And of course, as always with me, there's the secret third option of God just not existing. I guess that's not really a secret. If you somehow managed to get to this point in the video and still thought that I believed in God, then congrats, I guess, but I am most definitely an atheist.
Yeah, I love that you use the word brokenness because that is the way we were constantly talking with things with our daughter all the way into their teen years.
I just love that you describe people as broken so that we can indoctrinate our daughter into having the same bigotry as we do. How wonderful. I hope for your kids' sake that none of them turn out to be LGBTQ, because if they do, they will have grown up with you reinforcing time and time again how broken LGBTQ people are. And while you'll pretend that it's on the same level as the sins that you'll admit to, it's clear from context clues that being LGBTQ carries more stigma with it in your mind than any of the other ones. And they'll likely have heard sermons that equate being LGBTQ with bestiality or child abuse. And when they figure out that that's who they are, they'll know that their parents who are supposed to love them think of them as a heinous, immoral monster, an abomination, to go back to the biblical language. And from that perspective, it becomes trivially obvious why mental health outcomes are so much worse in intolerant environments than in loving and affirming ones. Well, the spiteful idiot inside me does want to wish an LGBTQ kid on you because of how much pain I know it would cause you, but that guy's a spiteful idiot who overlooked the fact that it would be so much worse for the kid, and I wouldn't wish that experience on anyone. Good thing I'm not religious, or I might have thought that the spiteful idiot was the voice of God. And just to make the metaphor blunt, the spiteful idiot is what I call my intrusive thoughts. You know, those thoughts that just pop into your head out of nowhere and aren't really in line with who you are as a person, being negative, mean-spirited, and sometimes even violent. And hello to the person or people in the audience who thought that they were alone in that experience and were afraid to tell anyone about it. I'm here to reassure you that it's normal. Even neurotypical people have intrusive thoughts sometimes, though neurospicy peeps tend to experience them more frequently. This has been your periodic mental health PSA with Rhino. Thanks for listening.
To talk about it is human nature for all of us to try to meet our needs in our own way.
Yes, and there's nothing wrong with meeting your needs as long as you aren't hurting anyone else in the process. And I fail to see how being in a loving relationship causes harm to other people, but only if the genitals of the people in the relationship match.
And that homosexuality from our worldview is a way that we're trying to meet our needs in our way.
Oh, you were saying that meeting our needs in our way is a bad thing. I guess I should have been able to figure that out, but here we are.
That's in Genesis, even the chapter 3 of the fall. You know, Eve tries to meet her own desires and her own needs in her own way, rather than trusting God with his ways and his design.
Well, to put it bluntly, his design was shit. He put a fruit tree in the middle of the garden, made it look appealing with fruit that was obviously good to eat, then made people without the knowledge of good and evil, told them not to eat from that tree, and then plunked a talking snake down that he knew would tempt them into eating from the tree that he could have made unappealing or placed somewhere out of reach. So when the snake, who Christians believe was the devil, the living incarnation of evil, came and told Eve to eat from the tree, Eve does not at this point have the knowledge of good and evil, so how is she to know that the snake cannot be trusted? And those are just a few of the problems with the story when you put the modern Christian spin on it. When you look at what the story actually is, the snake is just a talking snake, not the devil. Eve did not yet exist when God told Adam not to eat from the tree, and even if she did, she wouldn't know that it was wrong to disobey God. She didn't get that knowledge until after she ate from the tree. And then, after eating from the tree, the reason that is explicitly given for them being kicked out of the garden is because God doesn't want them to have the knowledge of good and evil as well as being able to live forever by eating from the tree of life, because apparently if you know the difference between good and evil, and you live forever, you are a god. And God doesn't like competition, so he had to prevent them from becoming gods by booting them from the garden and placing a guard at the tree. You'd think that he could have put a guard by the first tree before all this went down. So, yeah, it's not that Eve didn't trust God, it's that she didn't know any better and wasn't even there when God said the thing that she would need to have trusted in the first place.
And that is the temptation for all of us. So it's really not making homosexuality the issue.
Yeah.
It's just putting it under the umbrella of all the things that humanity struggles with.
Yeah, no. Putting it under such an umbrella is disgusting, actually. That's the same umbrella that murder is under. Are you saying that a loving relationship with more penises than you would prefer is the moral equivalent of murder? I bet you would say that, which is, again, disgusting.
And we struggle, our kids are going to struggle, and it normalizes the fact that we all desperately need God. And really the challenge is on day to day is to trust God.
When God says to do shit that results in children committing suicide, like subjecting them to conversion therapy, then no, I am not going to trust God. My preference is for children to be alive and happy. If your God has an issue with that, then quite frankly, he's a dick.
With who he says he is and who he says we are.
Who he says he is wildly inconsistent depending on where we are in the Bible, and I'm going to trust myself in figuring out who I am over an inconsistent character from ancient Near Eastern mythology.
And to live out of that. And so that's the message that we always come back to. Yeah. We're talking with our girls all the time, day in, day out, of what they see. And as parents, to be really intentional about having those conversations, because if you don't, they're going to go Google it, or they're going to talk to their peers, and they're going to get misinformation.
Hello, kids of Christian parents who found this video by Googling it and somehow made it this far in. Just want to reassure you that if you are LGBTQ, that is fine. There's nothing wrong with you. Go ahead and find happiness in whatever kind of relationship you want. And this isn't misinformation. Through this whole thing, I've been showing peer-reviewed scientific sources to back up the things I've been saying, and the link to every one that I've referenced can be found in the description. Studies can be hard to read, but you can find news write-ups about these studies fairly easily with just a bit more Googling. Googling is how you found me. You got the skills needed to find them. Good luck on your journey, I wish you all the best, and I'm going to leave a link in the description to the Recovering from Religion Foundation, which is an organization dedicated to helping people who have been harmed by religious belief. They've got a hotline that you can call to talk to someone, or use web chat if that works better for you. So if you feel like you need someone to talk to, and you don't feel like you can trust the people in your life, they're there for you. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Massology, who says, I don't care how smart you are, and if you a giant-looking Nerf and have a Star Wars toys, you are a child. However, you are very true about Mike, he a protty. However, yes, hell is real and you will go. Okay, so I assume the bad grammar in this one is due to a language barrier, so I'm not going to really hold that against them, but if you are going to insult someone, you should make sure that you're at least doing it intelligibly. But now I'm just going to use this as an opportunity to be the child that I've been accused of being, and like a kid showing off their toys to a new friend, I shall show off the shit that is on my shelf, which is usually blurry because I'm fancy like that. The majority of the figurines and models are 3D printed, and I made a time-lapse video of most of them, which I used as backgrounds in my videos for a while, so if you want to see that, go watch one of my videos from around 2022-ish, or my playlist compilation from where I respond to a Flat Earth documentary. Or, who knows, maybe Editing Rhino will remember to play some footage here. It was damn hard to get those time-lapses to not be jumpy and weird, so every chance I get to show them makes it a little bit more worth it. There's also some books, most of which I've actually read. For the most part, only books that I really like make it to the shelf. Sort of Lions Over There was sent to me by the author, and it is next up on my reading list, so it's there to remind me to read it when I'm done my book that I'm on now. And down on the bottom left, I'm so happy to be able to explain the visual joke that's been impossible for anyone to get up until now because of the aforementioned fact that I'm a fancy boy with a blurry background. But I've got the Answers in Genesis Answers series literally being propped up by The Rocks Were There, a book by friends of the channel RJ Downard and Jackson Wheat, which thoroughly and methodically goes through creationist arguments and absolutely tears them to shreds. So I like the idea that the organization known for its founder using the "were you there" defense of creationism is having their bad arguments propped up by a book that refutes them all and answers the question with "the rocks were there." Also, Mere Christianity is there too, because I didn't want to taint the good books with mediocre apologetics. I'm thinking of going through that book at some point, but I'll probably at least wait until the Scathing Atheist guys are done with it. And then we come to my Nerf gun, better known as the Saturn V Lego set. I actually really recommend this set as an educational tool. Not only is it fun to build because, you know, Lego, but building it was what really solidified for me exactly how it was that the Apollo astronauts did what they did, and why the docking maneuver was necessary. And honestly, just put into perspective just how much rocket fuel it takes to get some pretty small stuff into space. I built it with my kids, and I hope that they learned as much from it as I did. I definitely tried to make them learn with me, but, you know, kids. So, all that being said, yes, I am a child. No, hell is not real, I will not be going there, but it is quite disturbing that you seem to derive joy from the idea of people you don't like being tortured for all eternity. That's actually another aspect of the love everybody thing that Christianity has that doesn't really make sense. If you actually love everybody, then you should be genuinely distressed that God is going to torture most of them for all of eternity. And while that concern might come across in the act of evangelism, it should be done out of the absolute terror of what the monstrous despotic overlord will do if you don't worship him, rather than out of love for that being. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to go to ground.news/ViceRhino for 40% off their Vantage plan. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I livestream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Hikari Magic, Henry Lankin, Henry Padilla, or Padilla, and John. Just John. And of course, all the rest, who are the Nerf gun that blasts the astronauts to the moon that is my channel. If you'd like to prove that I'm a child trapped in a grown-up's body, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!